Opera. The very word opera conjures up all sorts of images. Many of these images may be comical or satirical because very often we see opera represented in cartoons or in television commercials. And in fact, there's something that's also mysterious about it. The word opera has all of these associations, but most people don't know quite what it is. In fact, there's nothing mysterious about it at all. Even the word itself is not mysterious. The Latin and the Italian word opera simply means work, but it doesn't mean work in the sense of labor. It means work in the sense of a work of something, as in a work of art, a work of literature, a work of poetry, a work of architecture, or a work of music. In fact, opera encompasses all of these. Let's take a look at this phenomenon. An opera tells a story, and this story very often comes from some literary source. It has a number of songs within it. Many of them are cast in poetry, so poetry is a part of opera. Now, opera is performed as a drama on the stage, so it encompasses architecture because stage settings are created to make a realistic presentation of the story. The stage settings are decorated, so art is a part of it as well. And it is basically set to music, so all of the things that you see here, art, literature, poetry, architecture, and music, are all represented in this marvelous art form. By definition, an opera is a drama set to music. Now, this actually is a somewhat redundant definition. Drama set to music, because in fact in our cultural tradition in classical times, dramas were always sung from beginning to end. It was not until the late Middle Ages that the two became separated in the West, and that has continued right to the present. In fact, if you were to take a look at the other cultures of the world before the 20th century, before the time that they came under the influence of Western culture and before the advent of the movie industry, you would see that universally outside the West, drama was always sung from beginning to end. Since we're going to spend a good amount of time taking a look at this art form in this course, you really should know something about its origins and its early history. In fact, the details that I'm going to present to you right now will be featured prominently on a test in this course, so make sure you know every single one of them. First, opera was born in the Renaissance. In fact, it's one of those many gifts of the Renaissance that we take for granted. And opera was born from an attempt to revive the performing style of classical drama. I already told you that classical dramas were sung from beginning to end. People of the Renaissance read about this practice, and they wanted to restore it for use in their own time. We know a great deal of very precise information about its origins. First of all, we know exactly where it was born. It was born in Florence. Today, Florence is just a city in the middle of a country called Italy. But back in the Renaissance, it was an independent country. It was one of the wealthiest countries in Europe because of its banking industry, and most of the crown heads of Europe were in debt to the bankers of this country, so it was very, very important. Within that city, there was a group that called itself the Camerata. Now, the Camerata was a group of Florentine intellectuals who got together every so often in the palace of one of its members to talk about the world, to talk especially about the classical world and how the classical world might be revived in their own time. And they are the people who invented opera. Among them was Vincenzo Galilei, the father of Galileo Galilei, the famous scientist and astronomer. Vincenzo Galilei was a Florentine nobleman, an excellent musician, and one of the inventors of opera. The inventors of opera represented most of the sciences and the arts, and so their efforts to revive the performing style of classical drama were very sophisticated indeed. In fact, they gave actual thought as to what would be the proper musical texture for such an enterprise. And they made their decision on musical texture by what they read in classical writings about music. In fact, what happened here was what happened with the invention of word or text painting. They misunderstood what classical writers had said about something, and they ended up inventing something entirely new. And that is the case with the musical texture that they considered to be ideal for it. The texture that they agreed upon was something called monody, and in the adjectival form it is monodic. Let's take a look at this word. You already know that mono means one. It can also mean alone. And D comes from a Greek stem that means to sing. So taken together, it literally means to sing alone. And it refers to melody with some sort of a simple accompaniment. Classical writings, when describing the performance of classical dramas, said that the actor sang alone to a simple accompaniment of a lyre. Now, the actual texture to which classical writers were referring was something that we call heterophony. Now, heterophony is a type of monophony. It is not a polyphonic texture, and it was something that was unknown, or at least not very well known to the musicians of the Renaissance who invented opera. So basically, they never guessed that what the classical writers actually were talking about was heterophony. Renaissance musicians basically understood this to mean that the singer would sing a melody and that the instrument would provide some sort of simple accompaniment. And the type of accompaniment provided by Renaissance musicians was far more complex than that used by the ancients in heterophony, and so a whole new musical texture was born. Monody, melody with simple instrumental accompaniment. Basically, the kind of musical texture that you hear in 99.999% of all the music that you hear today. So the next time you hear a song that has a melody with some sort of accompaniment to it, think back to the invention of opera, think back to the Renaissance. That's where it began. Now that we know something about the origins of the genre, let's take a look at its early history. And let's begin by taking a look at what opera was during the Renaissance. Opera began as the plaything of the extremely wealthy. In fact, it was invented in a palace. The first persons to hear of it were the best-born people of Florence and people who were very wealthy as well. And it was a type of entertainment that took a great deal of planning and preparation, and it required a very large outlay of cash to do properly. Because of its cost and because of its spectacle, it eventually became the ultimate status symbol. And it seemed that no important marriage in the Italian-speaking world of the late Renaissance and the early Baroque era was quite complete without the performance of an opera, a drama in music. This was to change during the Baroque era, particularly during the late 1630s in Venice. Now take a look at this here. I've given you an approximate date, the late 1630s, and I've given you a place. Both of these are important, and I want you to remember both of them. In fact, it was in Venice during the late 1630s that the first public opera houses were open. So for the first time in history, anyone who could afford the price of a ticket could afford to hear an opera. Remember this important date and event.